Thank you for bearing with me through these hiccups, but we are online now, so that's great. Zoom kind of did a little funny thing and required passwords today, so I'm glad everybody was able to figure out what that password was, and I'm going to see if maybe we can avoid that next week and give them a call later. But at any rate, thank you guys so much for coming to this webinar. This is on the impact of trauma, and it's actually part one of a two-part series. We'll do part two next week at the same time and same place. And then we also had a webinar last week. If you're interested in looking at that, it was just on basically human trafficking, very broad, very basic. And that is up on our website under the resources page if you want to go take a look at that. This one is also going to be recorded, and I'll upload that in the next few days as well. If you want to refer to it or send it to anybody, it will be available for everybody. My name is Delana May, and I am the Executive Director of Dark Bali. And Dark Bali is an anti-trafficking organization that works in Indonesia. And our vision is to see sex slavery abolished and the broken lives of survivors restored through creating awareness, empowering advocacy, and building partnerships for the prevention, restoration of children in Bali and throughout Indonesia. So basically what we do is provide support for on-the-ground frontline Indonesian organizations, training and resources, data collection and research. We help establish task forces across different cities and different regions. So lots of fun stuff that we're doing. And I will be referring to anti-trafficking work as we're talking through this and kind of sharing how that's impacted this sector in our work. But really this is designed to be a lot more broad. It's for people who maybe have experienced trauma themselves. It's for people who are in relationships with people who've experienced trauma, or even if you're a caregiver or a friend of a caregiver, should hopefully really help kind of explain what this trauma thing is and what we mean when we're talking about it. To get us started though, I want to start with kind of a little caveat that's pretty important, especially when we're talking about pretty tough topics, and especially in the environment that we're in right now where things are really difficult, emotions are high. A lot of us, maybe all of us, are kind of scared with coronavirus and everything feels uncertain. So bottom line is take good care of yourself. If something's coming up for you in the middle of all this that doesn't feel good, please step out of the room. If you need to turn it off, like I said, it's being recorded, so you can come back to it later if you feel like you're ready for it. But take good care of yourself in this. Also, I'm not your doctor and I'm not your therapist. So if you feel like something's coming up and you really are looking for further help, you should find a clinician that can help you out with that. This is informative. It's not going to license anybody to do any kind of therapeutic work. So just want to kind of lay that foundation for us. So what we're going to get into in the next 40 minutes in the topic of trauma is designed to move us to part two next week. So part two is going to be a lot more practical. What do we do with this information? Whereas this webinar today is just going to kind of lay the basic foundation so that we understand what we're dealing with. It's pretty much impossible to have good results or good kind of what do we do with this without actually know what we're dealing with. So we're going to talk about what we're dealing with. The objectives for this webinar are pretty simple. We're going to talk about what trauma is and what it isn't and why it occurs. We want to move into a conversation a little bit on trauma bonding, and I decided to throw this one in there because it's probably a topic that I found to be the most valuable as I've taught through this same seminar. I've taught this a few times in Indonesia, generally with caregivers, people that work in safe houses or different kind of recovery programs across the country. And for the most part in Indonesia, people that are working in these programs don't necessarily have like a social worker background, or they're not counselors. They're just kind of average people that have taken these positions in these organizations to try to help. And I know pretty much every time I've taught it, somebody's ended up crying and said, oh, that explains. It's not me. It's not that I'm doing anything wrong. It's actually that there's this trauma bond experience. And so I want to talk more about that because I think it really brings up a lot of empathy and really helps the average person understand why it's so complicated to recover from a traumatic experience. And then we're going to get into neurological consequences of trauma. because I think as we talk about what trauma does to the brain itself, it can be really, really helpful to understand how that kind of cascades or dominoes into the body and the mind and the emotions. So we will end with that part, and that will set us up to talk about what do we do with that as we move into the seminar next week. So let's just get started with a basic definition of trauma. When we talk about trauma, what exactly is it that we're talking about? So these are some standard definitions. Trauma is the personal experience of interpersonal violence, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, severe neglect and loss, and or the witnessing of violence, terrorism, and disasters. And then going on to say a person's response involves intense fear, horror, and helplessness, extreme stress that overwhelms the person's capacity to cope. So I want to zero in on that last sentence, extreme stress that overwhelms, excuse me, a person's capacity to cope. I think what I've seen the most is kind of two issues when people talk about trauma. One is the trivialization of it. Oh my God, that was so traumatic. They did not have my soda. Obviously that's ridiculous. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma, that trivialization of trauma, or even I was so triggered. No, you weren't. So we're going to get into like real definitions of what trigger is and what trauma is. And the other thing I think is the big myth is that trauma is an event. Trauma is not actually an event. And a lot of people are surprised when they hear that for the first time. Trauma is the experience of an event. And what's interesting about that is that different people will experience things differently. So if you have a lot of reading time on your hands right now, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's by Dr. Vanderkolk. And he is amazing and has been working in the field of trauma for his entire very long career. In fact, he was the physician who coined the term post-traumatic stress disorder after all of his work and research with combat veterans. And so he's kind of the man on the subject of trauma. So this book is great. The Body Keeps the Score, highly recommend. But he tells a story in the book that I thought was really, really helpful to understand how trauma is not an event, but an experience of an event. And so in this story, he was talking about how during 9/11, he was actually in New York City. He was in an apartment near a window facing the towers. And he was there with his brother and his young nephew. And when the airplane hit the tower and the towers fell, they all saw it. They all watched it happen. And he explains how in New York City that day, thousands of people actually witnessed the towers fall. And many of them experienced that as a traumatic event. It was very traumatizing for them. It was terrorizing. They were horrified. They felt hopeless. They couldn't cope. They felt like they were going to die. It was traumatic. But he said for his nephew did not experience it as trauma, even though he was little and even though it was confusing. Ultimately, his nephew felt safe. He felt okay because he was with his dad, he was with his uncle, and he didn't experience that as an overwhelming situation that he couldn't cope with. And that's why you have people, even sometimes people in the same family, that go through the exact same experience, and one will come out with a really different outcome than somebody else. And it's not something that we want to put like a moral label on as somebody was better or worse. There's lots of reasons why somebody might have experienced something as traumatic and somebody else did not. But at the end of the day, understanding that trauma is not so much about the experience itself or so much about the event itself, but about how a person experiences it. So we want to differentiate between a few different kinds of trauma just to kind of get some of our lingo on the same page. That bottom one talking about big T versus little t trauma. So big T traumas are things that are kind of obvious to us generally, things that we would expect to be traumatic. A lot of that stuff in that first definition, we're talking about a sexual assault or getting beaten or being in the middle of a natural disaster, watching somebody that you love die violently. That's pretty obvious. Those are big T traumas and they usually cause this traumatic experience. But there are also things like little t traumas, and these are things that might not be so obvious. You're really going to see a lot of variation from person to person. So maybe losing your religious community, going through that could cause somebody to feel so overwhelmed that they're not able to cope. Losing a pet or something like that, that's something that maybe is not so obvious, but again, it's something that can cause a lot of stress for somebody. You also see caregivers experiencing trauma themselves. So secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Again, maybe you're not watching these events unfold. You're not the one that it's happening to, but as you're listening day to day to all of these stories that have happened to people that you care about, it can really eventually erode your ability to cope. And then we have things that are acute traumas or complex traumas. Acute traumas are something that happened in a moment. Maybe you got hit by a car, or you saw somebody get hit by a car and you experienced trauma through that. And then you have complex traumas. And these are things that are exactly what it sounds like. They're complex. They're happening over time, and they're have lots of different things feeding into them. So a situation where you're being trafficked, or if you're in the middle of a domestic violence situation, or you're being raised in an abusive home, you experience bullying. So these are just things that kind of build up on themselves and often have multiple different factors feeding into them, or even multiple kinds of traumas. And I think it's helpful to look at these because a lot of times we expect those big T traumas to be the biggest issues. But a lot of research has shown that even a little T trauma, something that's happening like a slow faucet, just a drip, 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 ultimately can have longer and bigger emotional impact in the long term than a single big T event. And so this is not to diminish the big T events, but it's to say we need to understand that a lifetime or a long time of little T trauma can actually have just as big of an impact. So definitely want to see our empathy build up in that. So hopefully that's really clear. And we have our definitions of trauma kind of laid there. So I want to set that aside for a second, and I want to talk about trauma bonding. Again, I think that this is a really, really helpful thing to understand if we're talking specifically about trauma that involves violence or complex trauma situations like domestic violence or like a human trafficking situation. What's really disgusting is that the trauma bonding process is actually often understood by abusers. Sometimes they even know the name for it. I know that law enforcement has found different kind of literature and communications between abusers where they kind of coach each other on how to create a trauma bond. And the reason is when you have created a trauma bond, you've created a submissive victim. So let's use domestic violence for kind of an example for this. If you've worked around domestic violence or you paid attention at all, you know that one of the biggest questions that people come up with when they talk about domestic violence, and maybe this is a wife that's, you know, being beaten by her spouse or verbally abused, the question is, well, why did they stay? And trauma bonding is one really big reason. So the goal of an abuser in these situations is to create submission. And we talked a little bit about the grooming process in our webinar last week. So that's definitely tied in. So there's a goal to create a submissiveness in the victim. And this is how they do it. I love to put up this slide because it always kind of surprises people as they read through this list of how does an abuser alter the reality of a victim and create submission in them. So a lot of this stuff makes sense. You're like, yeah, okay, abuse and rage and deprivation. And then you get to that last one there on the bottom, the right slide, and it says acts of kindness and care. It's kind of like, which one of these things doesn't belong here? And that surprises us because it doesn't seem like that should have anything to do with it. But actually that is a key factor in creating a trauma bond. So the trauma bond, to put some definition to it before we kind of talk about it in more detail, a trauma bond is basically an attachment. Just like the mother and the infant have an attachment to one another, a trauma bond is the same kind of attachment, and there's a lot of research that suggests it's an even stronger bond than the one between an infant and a caregiver. So this psychological bond, called a trauma bond, is an emotional tie that develops between two people where one person intermittently harasses, beats, threatens, abuses, or intimidates another. And I think that intermittently is really, really key there. So for the trauma bond to happen, a few things have to be true. First, there is an imbalance of power. You have somebody in control and somebody being controlled. You have somebody with authority and somebody without it. And generally you have somebody that on some level is offering or meeting the needs of the person that's being abused. Maybe they're providing housing and food, or maybe they are the source of emotional connection and of love and care to the person being abused. And then we get into that intermittent thing. The abusive behavior is sporadic. It's not, evil, 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 evil. It's actually evil, evil, good, evil, evil, good. There's good things that are happening. So for example, you might have the boyfriend who's being super sweet and super kind, but then he snaps and he hits her, right? But then the next day he goes out and buys her flowers and starts making it up to her. And so you kind of see this constant cycle, and it's very sporadic. It's not necessarily something that's predictable. But what these two things have, they kind of connect. There's this imbalance of power and this abusive behavior, and that does something to the mind of the victim, where if I'm the victim, I need this person for some sort of support, whether it's physical or emotional. And I'm going to talk myself into believing that this abusive behavior has an explanation and maybe I can excuse that. So then they go into this denial phase, and you hear things like, well, I mean, sometimes he yells and screams when he gets really stressed out, but really he's a good dad. Or, you know, I know that he loves me. It's just that, like, we're really out of money right now, and that's why he wanted me to get involved in prostitution to just help our family out. Or, you know, really, she wants to be a good parent. It's just that she's, you know, having a hard time making ends meet, and so she did this. And so you start seeing these like denial behaviors in the victims. And ultimately what that comes down to is that our brains and our minds, their number one job is to keep us safe and to keep us alive. And if I'm a victim that relies on this abusive person for whatever significant needs to be met, it works a whole lot better for me to be able to deny those bad things and to kind of look at those good things that do happen in that relationship and kind of only look at those, only see those. So I only see the flowers. I don't see the abuse that came before the flowers, if that makes sense. And again, I think when I've been able to communicate this in a caregiving setting, it's really caused a lot of relief, because one of the big issues that we have in the anti-trafficking world is seeing survivors go back. They go back to their abusers, just like in a lot of domestic violence situations. And it's really hard for caregivers to understand, what did I do wrong? What's happened? Why would they do this? I love them. I take care of them. I don't beat them. I don't require them to do horrible things. And yet this person that does, they've gone back to them. And really what it boils down to is it's very likely that there's a trauma bond between that trafficker and between the victim that causes them to do that. So if you've looked around a little bit or studied it all, Stockholm syndrome would be an extreme example. So that's a condition where maybe somebody that's been kidnapped ends up in a relationship with the person that took them and kind of excuses their behavior. Kind of joke about Beauty and the Beast, the Disney movie, where you kind of see that in that relationship as well, where it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that this person that has kidnapped her, held her captive, verbally abused her, hurt her father, and yet she wants to make excuses for him and ultimately falls in love with him. So that's an extreme example, but I think it's actually a really helpful visual in understanding trauma bonds. So setting that one aside, I wanted to just pull that in. I want to get into talking particularly about the impact of trauma on our brains, and looking specifically at kids in particular. So there's a myth that, hey, kids are real malleable and kids are super resilient, so anything can happen to a kid and they'll just bounce back. Like, don't worry about it. And I've even heard that a bit right now as we're going through this coronavirus thing. It's like, kids will be fine. But when we're talking about brain impact, that's measurably and demonstrably false. A child's brain is Play-Doh. It's squishy and it changes, and an impact of a trauma is significant on that. As we get older, the elasticity or the squishiness of our brain decreases, and so our brains go from like Play-Doh to clay. So they never get hard like a rock. There's still always some elasticity, but it's a lot more the younger the kid is. So there's kind of good news and bad news with that. The good news is that we can always adapt. We can always grow. If we've had trauma in our past, it's never too late to start dealing with some of those things, because we still have brains that are malleable. There's still brains that are soft, and they can still find healing. And also early intervention. Obviously, if a kid's brain is Play-Doh still, like, that's a really good thing for us for early intervention. The bad news is what we know from studying children that have been abused and comparing them to children that have not been abused is essentially that a child that has gone through significant complex trauma is just not going to be the person that they would have been without it. There are actual developmental changes that happen in the brain structure that kind of cascade into the rest of their bodies that really matter. So there is a lifelong impact when we're talking about trauma, especially complex trauma, especially in childhood, and we have to reckon with that reality. So getting into that, I just thought this was a really interesting scan. This is a scan of a healthy kid's brain and a scan of a child that was abused and neglected in an orphanage. And I mean, to put it kind of crudely, I think it just kind of shows that trauma causes brain damage. So we're going to talk about what that damage can be. And then we're going to kind of have that as our baseline, and then we'll be ready to start the next seminar next week where we talk about, well, what do we do with that? How can we heal and how can we get better? And how can we increase resiliency so maybe the impact is less? So we'll get into that more in next week's webinar. But I want to kind of break down the brain system into two parts. And everyone has their video off, so you can totally do this with me and no one will laugh at you. But if you hold up your hand and you think of this as your brain, we have a limbic system, which is right in the middle of our brain, and then we have the cortex, which is the part that overlays it. So the limbic system, if you put like a line right through your forehead and one through your temple, where those intersect right in the middle of your head, that's where your limbic system is. It's right in the middle of your brain. And your limbic system is your emotional brain. This is the part that's reactive. This is the part that's instinctual. This is the part that we share with pretty much all creatures, right? Wherever they are on the evolutionary chain, we have a limbic system, and it's where we react. It's where we feel things. As you get closer to humans, so primates, mammals, they also have a cortex, and they have a more and more developed cortex. Our cortex is kind of that, what we think we see when we see a brain, all that gray squishy stuff. And the cortex is the thinking brain. So this is the brain that's in charge of logic. It's the brain that's in charge of communication. It's the brain that's thinking. It's making all of those connections. Now, we are designed to go through life like this, with our brain and our limbic system coordinating and talking. However, when an event happens, a stressful event happens, basically our thinking brain goes offline and it stops working. And immediately our limbic system starts reacting. So adrenaline is pumped out, and cortisol is pumped out. Those are hormones that are associated with keeping us alive. And again, that's the brain's job. The brain's job is to just keep us alive. And so the limbic system is the part that is reacting, and reacting super fast. So for example, if I'm walking somewhere and all of a sudden I see a lion, my brain needs to immediately react and send my body to run or do whatever I need to do to stay safe. I don't have time to think about that and be like, oh, actually, that's just a statue. I don't need to be scared of that. It's fine. I'll just keep walking. No, if my brain is just going to go, whoa, lion, run, and it's not going to sit and spend time thinking about it. So when there are people that are in living lives where they're experiencing trauma regularly, they're super stressed out all the time through these horrible events that might be happening to them, they're walking around and living their life like this. Very little of their time is spent with the thinking brain engaged. They're constantly being put into a stressful, reactive situation. And if you think about this in terms of children and how their brains are developing, it kind of makes sense what happens. So for example, if you want to increase your biceps, you start working those out, right? If you stop using something, it atrophies. So if you spend a lot of your time like this, where your limbic system is super engaged, but your thinking brain is not even online, you see changes. You see atrophy in the thinking brain, and you see elevation in the limbic system. And because we're whole people, nothing can happen in our brain and in our bodies that's not going to affect other things. So you can't have a brain change that's not going to affect your physical body or your emotional health or mental health as well. So looking at some of those changes that happen in our brain, if somebody has gone through life experiencing significant trauma, complex trauma spend a lot of their childhood like this with their brain offline, there's a few things that we see that are pretty common. The first is a smaller frontal lobe. So this is a part of the cortex in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is related to our thinking. It's related to our reason and our logic. And so when the frontal lobe is smaller, that just means that there's going to be less learning often and difficulty with problem solving skills. So making those logical connections can be tough for somebody whose frontal lobe didn't fully develop because they were in the middle of trauma all the time. Another thing that we see is an underdeveloped left brain. So the left side of the brain is where our communication center is. And so they might struggle with language. They might struggle with different things associated with language and language development. There's also often a smaller corpus callosum. So that's the piece that is helping the right brain and the left brain communicate with each other. And a smaller corpus callosum is associated with mood disorders and personality disorders. So again, this is not to say that everybody that experiences trauma as a kid or experiences complex trauma is going to have these things, but we know that there's an association with them and it's more likely that they will. And it's, you know, if you're a caregiver, you understand you're just going to be dealing with these things a lot more often. And then finally, our limbic system, when it is activated all the time, you start seeing abnormalities. Mentioned before, there's different stress hormones that are secreted when we're in stressful situations. And it makes sense that if you're having these things secreting and just flowing into your body all the time, more than it's designed to, you're going to see consequences. So all these hormones can cause increased cardiac issues, metabolic issues. You see a lot more immune disorders. If you're curious, you can actually look up some stuff on ACE scores, so adverse childhood experiences. And there's been a lot of newer studies in the last few years about this. The new general surgeon of California has pioneered a lot of stuff. She has a really interesting TED Talk out about it. And they basically created a protocol or a way to scan adults as well as children and look at kind of these different, it's like check boxes of experiences that somebody might have had. And they found that the more check boxes that somebody can tick in these adverse childhood experiences, so these kind of traumatic events that can happen to a kid, like the death of a family member or abuse or growing up in a family where there's substance abuse, those are a few of them. But they found direct correlations with that and medical problems like cancer and kidney disease and all sorts of things that you don't automatically think of as a result of trauma. But again, we're whole people and our bodies are connected, and the trauma that we experience actually has this cascade effect in our bodies. A couple more that I want to mention as well that I think are really helpful to understand, especially as we are setting up for next week, is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus's job is basically to tell us how to feel about what we think. It's the piece of the brain that tells us how to react to something. It tells us, is this a threat or is this not a threat? And what you see in people who have a decreased function of their hippocampus is that they struggle to accurately define what is and isn't threatening. And so if you're in a relationship or you are somebody that has complex trauma, you might notice something happens and everyone else is expecting you to freak out and you just kind of don't. You're just like, whatever. And then the opposite can be true too, where something that everybody else kind of seems to think is no big deal feels like this huge, huge thing to you, and you totally flip out over it. And so that's something we see all the time in aftercare settings, is it just doesn't always make sense what people get upset about and what they don't get upset about. And that could be a result of a decreased function of the hippocampus. And then finally, I wanted to touch on the memory dysfunction. So this is super fascinating to me and I think is really, really helpful. There's a link at the bottom of this slide that talks a little bit more about this kind of stress memories and non-stress memories, but to kind of put it into not super scientific terms, when we have memories that are made when our brain is online, those memories are really, really different and stored really, really differently than when we have a memory that's made when we're in stress and we're in our limbic system is the one that's taking over. And this is even down to like the molecular level and the amino acids that are used to make memories when we're here and memories when we're here are different. So when we have a normal memory that's made while we're walking around and everything's fine, our thinking brain is engaged, those memories are stored as past tense experiences. They're stored in sequential order, and they are stored with our language engaged. And this totally makes sense, right? If we know what the thinking brain does, the thinking brain is logical. The thinking brain thinks. The thinking brain is associated, or the cortex is associated with language. All that stuff's engaged. So those memories are put in there. So a normal memory. 3 weeks ago, I went to the grocery store, I went to the dairy section, and then I went to get some bread. And while I was standing by the bread, my friend Bob came over and we started talking, and we decided to hang out later that day. Normal memory, you see the sequential order, I'm able to communicate about it. I know that it happened 3 weeks ago and it's not happening right now. On the other hand, memories that are happening or that are made while our limbic system is engaged are really, really different. So a traumatic event, if I'm experiencing a trauma, my memory of that event is going to be associated with my limbic system. So limbic system memories are not past tense, they're still remembered in present tense. They're not remembered sequentially, they're actually remembered really out of order because that logical sequential ability to think doesn't exist right then because I'm like this, right? And they're not associated with words, they're associated with sensations and my senses. So I remember listening to this podcast about this woman, and she had been raped at one point, and she talked about this experience she had. It was years after the assault, but she was just walking outside one day, and all of a sudden she found herself running, and she was running for her life, and she ran for an entire mile before she finally stopped. And she was like this, and she finally stopped, and her brain came back online, and she was like, whoa, what was that about? And she kind of processed and thought through it, and she realized, oh, there was somebody that passed me on the street, and he was wearing the same cologne that my attacker was wearing. And so as soon as she smelled that smell, it was associated with that memory that she had. And again, that memory is a present tense, not a past tense memory. And she does this, her brain stops thinking. All she knows is danger, danger. That smell is associated with an assault, run. And so she ran. And that is the definition of a trigger, not I got upset about something or I got mad at somebody or this thing reminded me of something. When our brains are activating a memory that's stored in our limbic system and we experience that as present tense, that's a trigger. Our body reacts just like it's happening right now. So as I've kind of learned more about memory, and this is, something that I find really fascinating, what we've realized is the work that we have to do, particularly as we're working with like law enforcement and different trainings that we do in Indonesia, we're trying to help them do good victim witnessing. So getting testimony from victims, and they get super frustrated because they're trying to talk to somebody about their experiences being trafficked, and they're pulling up memories that were here. And so a lot of times victims really struggle to tell the story because that memory is not encoded with language, it's encoded with sensations. So maybe they know what they were seeing, they know what the tile floor looked like, and they know what the smells were associated with that memory, but they don't necessarily have the ability to describe it in language. And when they try to, it's usually out of order. And then they tell it again and it's in a different order. And then they tell it a third time and then it's in a third order. And that can get super, super frustrating for law enforcement. But what we want to see is an empathy develop. And as our law enforcement understands that these memories are traumatic memories, and so the victim is going to have a different way of processing and describing those than a normal memory. If we can develop empathy, then we see our law enforcement able to really work with victims and not just immediately dismiss their memory as a bunch of bull because it doesn't sound like a normal memory. And then on the caregiving side, if you're a therapist or you've experienced trauma therapy at all, you know that a lot of the goal is basically taking this memory that's encoded in a present tense experience and helping the client or the patient recode it to a past experience. And so when you have somebody that has something that has been a horrible traumatic experience, but they're able to relabel it and refile it in their brain as a past experience rather than a present experience, you see a lot of healing happen in that way. So again, lots of stuff happening in the brain, and obviously these have huge impacts on just how a person develops and in their bodies and minds. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about what we do when we have a trigger. So we'll talk a little bit more about triggers. We've kind of introduced those today, but how do we help people get from here to here? If I'm experiencing that in myself, how can I calm myself? We're going to talk a little bit more about building resiliency, and so that's kind of looking at it on the other side of things, and how can we help our community, how we can help ourselves and our kids even just prepare for kind of life's inevitable nasty things, and be able to come out the other side more successfully. And I think, you know, it can be really kind of sad to look at some of these things and go, whoa, that's a lot of really yucky stuff. But when we know that there are ways that we can cope and there are things that we can do to kind of mitigate some of this stuff, I think it's really, really helpful and actually pretty encouraging. I do want to give us a few minutes for questions or conversation if we want to have. I'll leave this up if anybody wants it. My email is there, and I love having conversations, so feel free to contact me if you want to talk more about this, but you don't feel comfortable doing it in the chat box. Or if you want to just kind of riff on some other things, that's fine too. Again, you can find this webinar on our website. I'm going to put that up in the next couple of days. If you want to know more about Dark Bali, that's also all up there. And then you can find us on all the social medias. Definitely go ahead and follow us, because we will put updates about the next webinar dates. And I will hopefully not have to have